In this video, we'll look at the beginning of the Watergate scandal, the break-in initial reaction. Of course, the Watergate scandal remains one of the nation's worst constitutional crises and one of its most famous political scandals. In fact, Gate, added to the end of words, has often come to signify a scandal in American political parlance. There have been, of course, hundreds of books written about Watergate. As I mentioned earlier, Nixon had grown awfully isolated, and he was vindictive and very, very cynical. And as president, he'd formed a group that was known as the plumbers, which operated as sort of a dirty trick squad in the rough and tumble world of politics. He called them the plumbers because they would go out and fix the quote-unquote leaks. Anyway, among others, the group included former CIA officers E. Howard Hunt and James McCord, and former FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy. And so they would sort of do things that to advance Nixon's goals, but were kind of shady. For example, in the Vietnam War, there was the publication of the infamous Pentagon Papers, which had been sort of released by a Department of Defense contractor named Daniel Ellsberg. And he'd given them to the New York Times, and they'd published them. And the stories seemed to discredit the White House and sort of suggest that the American government was lying to the American people. Now, while the stories focused on the Johnson White House, this really angered Nixon. And so Nixon was looking to discredit Ellsberg, and he had the plumbers break in to Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to see if he could find anything incriminating against Ellsberg. All of this came out when they were investigating the Watergate scandal later on, but that's just one example of the type of dirty tricks that the plumbers were doing. In any event, when Nixon launched his re-election campaign in 1972, the plumbers were transferred to the Committee to Re-elect the President, which had the interesting acronym CREEP. But it was led by Attorney General John Mitchell. John Mitchell had resigned his position as Attorney General to lead CREEP, the re-election campaign. A number of high-ranking people in Nixon's White House knew of the plumbers, knew of their dirty tricks operations, including, for example, Stuart Magruder, shown here on the left, who worked for CREEP and helped plan a break-in at the office of Larry O'Brien, who's shown here on the right. O'Brien was the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and Magruder and his allies planned to break in at O'Brien's offices so they could tap his phones and gain information about the Democratic National Committee operations. Therefore, on June 17, 1972, a break-in occurred at the Watergate building in Washington. It was shown here on the right, but that was where the location of the Democratic National Committee was and the office of the DNC chair, Larry O'Brien. A security guard at the Watergate building noticed that tape had been applied to one of the automatic locks on the doors so that it wouldn't automatically lock, and was curious. He'd gone in and found a bunch of men in decent clothes with thousands of dollars of electronic equipment. And so he called the police, and they ended up arresting a bunch of people. Several of them were Cuban and became known as the Cubans. But among those arrested was James McCord, shown here on the far left, who had obvious connections to the Committee to Re-elect the President. Of course, a break-in at the Democratic National Committee and, a bunch of men with thousands of dollars of electronic equipment perked the interest of the press. And at the Washington Post, two reporters, Bob Woodward, shown on the right here, the center right, and Carl Bernstein, sort of the center left, they were assigned to investigate it. And they proved pretty good investigators. Of course, the break-in began an investigation by the Washington police, and it also began an investigation by the FBI, because again, this was a DNC office, and these men obviously had thousands of dollars of equipment. This wasn't a normal break-in. So you got a Washington police investigation and an FBI investigation. We now know, after Watergate had gone its course, that Nixon had ordered the FBI off the case, and that was the cover-up that finally brought him down. But at the time, however, no one knew this, and the White House denied any involvement. What Woodward and Bernstein did, the Washington Post reporters, was they kept publishing stories that connected things to the White House officials. And they would cite an anonymous informant that they named Deep Throat. Years later, it was determined that FBI's Mark Felt had been Deep Throat, and Mark Felt obviously learned that Nixon had ordered the FBI off of investigating the break-in, and that bothered him, and so he clandestinely gone to Woodward and Bernstein and was feeding him information, hoping that Woodward and Bernstein would break open the case. In the end, Bernstein and Woodward won a Pulitzer Prize. By late 1972, a trial had begun of the Watergate burglars under Judge John J. Sirica. Now, at the time, the accused felt that they were being made scapegoats, and accordingly, McCord decided to tell all he knew. And when McCord decided to tell all he knew, soon this opened a floodgate of confessions. Of course, few people thought the break-in had anything to do directly with Nixon. This was right at the time of the 1972 election, and the investigations had begun, but, again, people didn't think it went as high as Nixon, and so Nixon was able to win a landslide re-election in November 1972. After the election, however, the investigations would continue, and of course, things would unravel for Nixon. This concludes the section on the break-in and the initial reaction to the initial beginning of the Watergate scandal.